Our next speaker is Natalia Teryda. Natalia came to the program from Argentina, where she has been working in marine conservation since she was 14 years old. Natty has a lot of experience and loves turtles and plans to continue to expand her knowledge in sea turtle conservation for future application in South America. Natty loves turtles. It's pretty clear. I have never seen Natty without a turtle necklace on. It's so clearly her passion, something that drives her. She was one of the students, and this I would say this is pretty unique, who got here and actually did the kind of capstone she thought she was going to do when she got here, right? It is what drives her, it is what she's passionate about, and that just comes through in everything she does. But there's more to Natty than just turtles. Natty is a Fulbright scholar from Argentina and a fantastic writer. I remember in the summer when we were doing the blog exercises early on and just being really, really impressed with Natalia's command of the English language, but also just her writing style. She has just a really compelling style that makes you want to keep reading. So I hope that in your passion for turtles, I hope that writing is something you still continue to do, because it's something you're really fantastic at, and it's been a real joy to have you here. So please join me in welcoming Natalia Teryda.
Well, thank you, Samantha, for that lovely introduction. So yes, as Samantha said, my name is Natalia. I go by Natty. That's easier, I think. And my capstone was about the economics perspective of marine turtle bycatch reduction efforts. So to begin with, marine fisheries are considered one of the main sources of fish product in the world, especially feeding billions of people. Based on these factors, they are managed under the Food and Agriculture Organization under the UN, also under regional fisheries management organizations, and domestically by state and federal state regulations. Even so, tuna and tuna-related species are one of the main fisheries in the world. They both in metric tons produced or caught, and also in the revenue produced. One of these species, and one of America's favorites, is the swordfish, which here in the US are mainly caught by the pelagic longline and the California drift gillnet. However, these types of fisheries come with the unintended consequence of bycatch of endangered species like sea turtles. So to avoid this problem, the US fisheries are highly regulated by the fisheries branch of NOAA, which states that fishers have to comply with a lot of regulations in both coasts. Some of these regulations are having to carry observers on board, also the mandatory use of the circle hook instead of the J tuna hook. Also, they have to use mackerel bait instead of squid, among many other regulations like having hard caps, allowable limits for the drift gillnet, and also time and area closures. However, complying with all these regulations has a really huge amount of effort and money for the fishermen, which creates a substantial economic impact for the fisheries. In consequence, it translates into a reduced catch rate and a reduced size of the overall fleet. So to meet the consumer's demand for swordfish, the US has to import the rest of the fish, or the swordfish in this case, from all over the world. More so, in 2007, Helby and others stated that up to 80% of the swordfish came from outside the country. So this dynamic supply and demand system generates something that is called the market transfer effect, which is the effects of regulations intended to control one market generates an increase in market production elsewhere, which with an unintended consequence, of increased bycatch and sea turtle mortality from the fleets that supplied the US. In the end, the market transfer effect will negatively affect the same species that are intended to be protected under the US regulations. So there is a need to better understand the process to assess the intended gains and also the unintended consequences of the US-based surface fisheries management. So to do that, the overall goal of my Capstone project was to answer to questions like, who is actually important? Who are the main important countries of swordfish to the US? How do they are compared to the reduction of bycatch? Or what are the bycatch levels in these places? And more so, what's the actual transfer effect? So to do that, my project was designed in a 3-step process. The first step was to identify the most important countries to the US. The second step was to compare the bycatch regulations and the management regimes of these countries. And the third step was to analyze the bycatch and the market transfer effect. So for the first step, I obtained the information of US swordfish production and the international import statistics from NOAA's commercial website, and the foreign domestic production from the FAO database. So that means I spent like a lot of hours looking at this kind of image. Yeah. With this information, I was able to compare the US landings and the international imports for the last few decades. As we can see in this map, the overall imports were higher than the landings in the US. And if we pay closer attention to the year 2000, that's when the US landing of swordfish started to going down, and they never recovered. But if we pay closer attention, even so, we can see from 2009 and on, the imports started growing, and they continue to grow. So throughout the years, there were a lot of countries involved with the international swordfish trade with the US. As we can see in this map, countries are from all over the world, and only for 2017 you can see how diverse they were and how many. Actually, there were 44 countries selling fish to the US. So from this image, can you imagine or can you find the pattern from where the swordfish came from? Well, if your guess was those countries, you are correct. So each of these countries imported more than 1,000 metric tons of swordfish only in 2017. And Ecuador was the highest with 2,700 metric tons only in 2017. But what does this mean for the allocation, for the domestic allocation of swordfish from these countries? Well, it means that around 50% of Brazil's and Ecuador and almost 90% of Canadian swordfish is exported to the US. This shows how important is the international trade of swordfish with the US for these countries. So once I knew who was importing, who was exporting the swordfish to the US, I needed to know how they were compared to the US. So to do so, I first looked at the regional management organizations. Here from now, they are going to be RFMOs. And out of the 5 that are in the world, 2 were of interest for this project because they encompass all the countries that I already mentioned. So I went through their reports, and I also looked into official government reports and peer review publications. And let me tell you something, it wasn't easy at all. Yeah, basically it wasn't easy because there were a lot of data gaps, also 3 languages involved. The official websites were incomplete or crashing, and the publications, most of them were updated. But well, after a lot of reading and brain meltdowns, several, I came up with this huge table with the regulations and the compliance. But for the purposes of this presentation, the main points that I want to highlight is the observer's coverage and the hook and bait type. So I found out that the US and Canada were both complying with the minimum 5% coverage that the RFMOs are requiring. In comparison, in South America, in Ecuador and Brazil, not only I found a few publications that it stated the actual number, for Ecuador it was stated as a factor of days fish instead of fleet coverage. Then if we look at the other map in the right, the hook and bait type was something similar. If you can see, the hook, the US was, in Canada, we're both using circle hooks, whereas Ecuador and Brazil are both using J hooks. The good point about these, or goodish, is that starting on November 2018, Brazil is going to require the mandatory use of circle hooks for their entire fleet, but that it's only going to start November 2018. As for the bait, the US was only using fish bait, and Canada is using both squid and fish. Squid was also found for the Brazilian fleet, and I couldn't find the information for Ecuador. So now, once I knew who and how, I needed to know what was their effect in the sea turtle population. So to do that, I needed to come up with bycatch data. And for that, I had two approaches to look at. So the first one was via direct contact with fisheries specialists via emails and phone calls. And the second one was through a lit review research, also known as data mining. So from both approach, I was looking for information like year of the study, the year, the target species, the observer's coverage, and mainly the bycatch effort. However, the first approach failed, so I had to rely exclusively in the lit review research. So the information came from peer-reviewed publications and reports. But with this information, I was able to conduct a market transfer effect, which, because of the nature of the data, there were a lot of assumptions, a lot of math, and a lot of conversions made, which led me to come up with these estimated turtles caught for the imported swordfish. And this is what I found. First of all, there were 4 species involved in the bycatch from these countries. And as you can see in the little black numbers, the Hawaiian longline, the little numbers are turtles per 1,000 hooks. That's a way of measuring the bycatch effort. So the Hawaiian longline had the smallest number, followed by Ecuador. And if we compare it to the Atlantic side had pretty much a higher number. But these numbers can be a result of the difference on the sea turtle population that these two ocean basins have. But what does this really mean, these turtles per 1,000 hooks? Well, it means that there are an average of these numbers in red of interactions of turtles caught for the foreign fleet when it is scaled to the proportion of domestic landings that is allocated to be exported to the US. So in comparison, if the US would produce the same amount of swordfish imported from those countries, these would be the numbers of interactions that would come from them. Yeah, these numbers are really different. The fact that the data came from publications on the low observers coverage in so many areas made the estimations really, really hard. But what we can say is that the real numbers lie in the same order of magnitude, and probably for Brazil it's an overestimation, and for Ecuador it's an underestimation. So to be completely honest, when I started this project, I didn't know how interested this was going to be. In fact, I always run away from economics, so I wasn't into that part. But at the end, I realized that this is a really interesting factor that needs to be involved when dealing with bycatch regulations, and it's because of that I would really like to continue looking for information and data to continue and come up with better and more accurate numbers. So to close, the take-home message is that swordfish fisheries management is resulting in unintended consequences. And as I show you today, not every single country has the same stringent regulation as the US has. And it makes it really hard to come up with the benefits that the US fisheries are doing. So the remaining question is, what's the alternative to all of these? Well, that's a really hard question, but some answers, and maybe easier answers, would be to promote better bycatch reduction measures, enforcement, and compliance from all over the world. So this way, the bycatch issue could be tackled as a holistic, multilateral approach instead of being only one country bearing all the cost for the bycatch reduction. Also, a really good approach would be to promote more experimental fisheries, like the deep set buoy gear that has been showing really good results with catch rates and a really low amount of bycatch. Also, to enhance the understanding of the species that are intended to be protected, and to come up with incentives to keep the fishers in the water. So with that, I would like to thank my committee members, especially Jeff Semenoff, that helped me from the beginning, Dick Norris and Steven Stows that helped me too with the economics part, and all the people that replied to my emails and made phone calls asking for information. And also, well, the Scripps family, my family from Argentina, and my friends. Thank you. Any questions? Don't be shy. Yes, Emily.
So that was really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. I had a question about your map that showed the different species of turtles that are being caught. The one species that I thought would be up there but wasn't are hawksbills, and I was wondering if you could tell us why that is.
Well, mainly because of the biology and ecology of that species. These fisheries that I was talking about are mainly pelagic, and hawksbills are closer to the shore, so maybe that's an answer for that.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I did not know what a longline was before starting this program, and I know that a few people in this audience probably don't know. Can you describe that more?
Sure. Yeah, I couldn't include that for the sake of time, but the longline fishery is a type of fishery that is basically a branch line, really, really long branch line that has other lines going vertically with hooks. Each single hook has a bait, which I said before, it can be squid or mackerel fish bite, and the bait actually comes from the target species and it's set in the water. Yeah, basically. That's an easy description of a long line. Anything else? Okay. Yeah, Samantha?
So it's interesting, the California drift gillnet numbers are 0, and it's interesting to see that the U.S. East Coast numbers are not 0, even though these species are protected under the same laws. So to what do you attribute that difference? Why there is sort of this zero tolerance policy in California and on the West Coast, but we're not seeing that on the East Coast?
Well, for once, the Hawaiian shallow set longline has 100% observed coverage. So the data that is shown here, it's 100% comes from the observers coverage. In the case of the East Coast, it's much lower. So a lot of that comes from estimating. The difference between the both coasts, I believe it has to do with the Fisheries Council units and also the RFMOs too. And yeah, I think that was the question. Yeah. Okay.